There is a phrase that sounds helpful until you actually try to do it. Organize your parents' affairs. It sounds simple, but once you begin thinking about what that could include, the phrase can become very heavy, very quickly. You may start thinking about medical information, bills, legal documents, passwords, household responsibilities, and all the things you are afraid no one will know when they are needed. Before long, what sounded like one task starts to feel like an entire department. You may picture yourself needing a full weekend, several folders, a spreadsheet, and answers your parent may not even have. And when the project feels that large, it is easy to keep putting it off. That does not always mean you are procrastinating. You may not be avoiding the work. You may simply be trying to start with a project that is too large to hold in your mind all at once. So today, I want to make the beginning smaller. You do not have to organize your parents' entire life before you can make things easier. You only need to make one part of the situation a little clearer than it was before. One of the first things that may help is changing what you believe starting is supposed to look like. Starting does not mean gathering every document. It does not mean fixing every problem. It does not mean creating the perfect family system, knowing every answer, or quietly taking responsibility for everything your parent may need. Starting can be much simpler. It can mean choosing one limited area and understanding it a little better. Maybe you and your parent clarify who handles one responsibility. Maybe you identify the question that keeps creating confusion. Or maybe you understand why one recurring situation keeps becoming harder than it should be. That may not look dramatic from the outside, but it is still progress. Before you start searching through drawers, moving papers, or asking for account information, it may help to begin with a conversation. Your parents' affairs are still your parents' affairs. Whenever possible, organizing should begin with cooperation, not with the adult child arriving with folders and taking over. You could ask, "What has been frustrating you lately?" Or, "Is there one responsibility that has become harder to keep up with?" You could ask, "What would make things feel a little easier right now?" Or, "Is there one area you would be comfortable looking at together?" The goal is not to force a full conversation about everything. The goal is to find one place where there is both a need and some willingness to begin. Your parent may be comfortable talking about one issue and protective of another. That does not mean nothing can be done. It means you begin where there is enough openness to work together. And sometimes, beginning with a smaller, less sensitive concern can create more trust than starting with the most serious issue in the room. Once you have that small area, look for one friction point. A friction point is not an entire category like finances, medical care, or household management. It is one small moment that keeps making life harder than it needs to be. It could be a repeated question, something that is hard to find, a responsibility no one is sure about, or a situation that regularly creates avoidable stress. For example, instead of saying, "Today we are going to organize all of your finances," you might say, "Let's understand why this one bill keeps becoming confusing." That is a much smaller conversation. It can be tempting to begin with the biggest, most important, or most emotionally difficult subject. But the hardest issue is not always the best first issue. A modest success can create momentum. A difficult first experience can make both you and your parent want to avoid the next conversation. So choose something small enough to examine, but meaningful enough that improving it would make a noticeable difference. Then, before you begin, decide what "finish for today" means. This is important because organizing sessions become overwhelming when they have no clear ending. If you plan to keep going until everything is handled, you may end the day tired and surrounded by more questions than answers. Instead, decide on one result that would make the conversation worthwhile. Maybe the goal is, by the end of today, we want to understand how this one responsibility is currently handled. Maybe it is, we want to identify what we know and what we still need to ask. Maybe it is, we want to decide where this one piece of information should be kept. Or, we want to understand why this situation keeps becoming confusing. That gives the session a boundary. You are not measuring success by how many papers you touched, how many drawers you opened, or how many hours you spent. You are measuring success by whether one situation became clearer. And as you talk, you will probably discover that some information is incomplete. That does not mean the session failed. You can place what you find into 3 simple groups. The first group is known. This is what you and your parent currently understand and can confirm. The second group is need to ask. These are questions that may require talking with another relative, an office, a company, or a professional. The third group is not available yet. This is information you cannot reasonably obtain during the current conversation. These 3 labels can keep one missing answer from taking over the entire day. You do not have to make every phone call as soon as a question appears or turn one small conversation into a full investigation. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do is recognize, we do not know this yet. That is still clarity. Another thing that creates overwhelm is trying to organize the situation and solve the situation at the same time. Those are not always the same task. You may discover a question that needs to be asked. You may notice an inconsistency. You may realize a responsibility needs attention. You may identify a conversation that needs to happen. Or you may find something that requires professional guidance. Identifying the issue is part of organizing. Resolving it may be a separate project. Your first conversation can be successful even when the underlying issue is not fixed. You may be able to say, we did not solve everything today, but now we understand what the actual question is. That is real progress. As other questions come up, give them one safe place to rest. You could use a plain sheet of paper labeled questions for later or things we still need to clarify. This is not about creating another complicated system. It is simply a way to keep the brain from saying, do not forget this, every few minutes. When a question has been written down, you can return to the small task you agreed to work on. And then, stop on purpose. This may feel strange when you have finally found the time and energy to begin. But knowing when to stop is part of organizing without becoming overwhelmed. Stop when the agreed upon outcome has been reached. Stop if the conversation is becoming tiring. Stop if your parent is becoming uncomfortable or frustrated. Stop if the task begins expanding into unrelated areas. And stop if you notice that you are trying to solve everything at once. Stopping does not mean you have failed or given up. It teaches both you and your parent that this work can happen in manageable portions. A calm stopping point can make it easier to come back another day. There are also a few things you may want to avoid during the first session. You do not need to begin by buying a complicated organizer or setting up a detailed system. A tool cannot tell you what your family needs before you understand the situation. You do not need to empty every drawer, box, folder, or cabinet. Creating a larger, visible mess can make the project feel even heavier. You do not need to insist on complete information. Some answers will take time. Some may not be available yet. You do not have to begin with the most emotional subject simply because it seems the most important. And you do not have to quietly accept responsibility for everything you uncover. Finding a problem does not automatically mean it is now yours to manage forever. So how do you know whether the first session was successful? Maybe one confusing situation makes more sense. Maybe you and your parent agreed on what you were addressing. Maybe you separated what is known from what is still missing. Maybe you avoided being pulled into every related problem. Maybe you ended without both of you feeling drained, and another conversation now feels more approachable. Progress is not only measured by completed paperwork. Sometimes progress is simply clarity. Organizing your parents' affairs is rarely one project completed in one sitting. It is usually a series of small decisions that gradually make responsibilities easier to understand. You do not need the perfect starting point. You need a starting point that is small enough to complete. You do not have to leave the first conversation with everything organized. You only need to leave with one part of the situation clearer than it was before. If you are ready for a simple place to begin capturing some of what you are learning, I created a free Parent Affairs Starter Kit. You can find it through the Blue Spark Virtual Solutions website. The link is in the description. And if you already use a tool, notebook, app, folder, or any other method that helps you manage things with your parent, please leave a comment. What works for you may help someone else find a starting point that feels manageable too. The goal is not to do everything today. The goal is to begin in a way that makes it possible to continue.